in the middle of his Olivet Discourse, Jesus says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," and then he adds, Matthew, I don't think Jesus said this, I think Matthew adds, "let the reader understand." Now, when you say that, "let the reader understand," that means this is going to be a little tough to understand. So it's going to be a little technical, and that's why Matthew adds that note. "Let the reader understand, and those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." When he speaks about an abomination of desolation spoken of through Daniel the prophet, he's highlighting something that Daniel talked about. And so it would have been a passage that they already knew, but the difficult part is that they knew it as having already been fulfilled. Because way back in the book of Daniel chapter 11, verse 30, talked about ships of Kittim. That was sort of a code word for Rome. "For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action." So he will come back, this earthly ruler would come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. "Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress," and here's the key part, "and do away with the regular sacrifice." Now that had been literally, physically fulfilled with an earthly temple back in 166 BC, 166 years before Jesus, where a Greek king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes was his nickname, Antiochus the Magnificent, he thought that was a self-imposed name. He had come into the temple and he had set up a statue of him. Well, actually, it was supposed to be a statue of Zeus, but they didn't know what Zeus looked like, so it looked like Antiochus. In other words, a statue of himself, and said, "Everybody has to worship this now, you're all going to be good Greeks." And it led to a revolt, and for about 3.5 years that stood in place before they finally pushed him out and eventually regained their independence. And it was all part of the history of the Jews. It's still celebrated to this day among our Jewish friends when they celebrate Hanukkah. That's what they're commemorating, not the bad thing that happened, but the good independence that they got on the heels of that. But here's Jesus citing that passage not as something that happened back then, which it did, but as something that would happen again, where again the holy place would be desolated. Again, there would be an abomination of desolation. And that took place, literally, 40 years from the time Jesus said these words. In 70 AD, when again a Gentile pagan conqueror came into Jerusalem, again set up an altar where the altar of God belonged, and ended up, in this case, actually destroying the temple, which has not been rebuilt to this day. In fact, if you go there today, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a fulfillment of the prophecy, but if you go to Jerusalem today, and I've been there, I've been on the Temple Mount, and there is standing in the place where the temple used to be a big structure. It's called the Dome of the Rock. It's not a Christian structure, it's not a Jewish structure. And it renders the place desolate to the worship of God. If I want to be really bold, and I'm not trying to be mean here, but I'm just borrowing the words of Matthew, could I call it an abomination of desolation? Like I said, I'm not saying that's the fulfillment of it. I'm just saying there's still an echo of that even today. So I would say that as you continue with the passage, it goes on to say, "Whoever's on the housetop must not get down, must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever's in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days." And he goes on to say, "But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be," and here's the word, "a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." Now, what's interesting is Eusebius, an early church historian living a couple hundred years later, talks about how Christians, on seeing that the Jews had revolted against Rome and the Romans were on their way, the Christians all remembered this prophecy and they said, "Gee, maybe we ought to get out of town." And they did. according to Eusebius, the Christians all moved out. They actually left Israel. They crossed the Jordan River and went into the Decapolis and other areas that were outside of Israel. And they heeded these words, and that tribulation, which an eyewitness, and here my eyewitness is Josephus. Josephus describes the fall of Jerusalem in his book, Wars of the Jews. And he says the entire nation, this is as the Romans came up and Titus, the Roman general, surrounded the city. He says the entire nation was now shut up by fate as in a prison, and the Roman army encompassed the city when it was crowded with inhabitants. Accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. Now, he wasn't trying to say this is a fulfillment of Matthew chapter 24. I don't think he'd ever read Matthew chapter 24. But that's his description of that event. Now, the next question is, well, will there be another tribulation still in the future? And my answer is, I don't know. We'll see. I think maybe Jesus is going to come back first. But when you ask that question, you have to understand that depending on where you live today or in the last 2,000 years, the church has been through lots and lots of tribulation. And so have other peoples. But the church is under heavy affliction, and that's just another word for tribulation. In fact, they're both translated from the same Greek word. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks quite a bit about affliction, and he's using exactly the same word that's used here to talk about tribulation. Okay, another question. Will there be a rebuilt temple? Well, I have to cite Jesus, where Jesus answered them and said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And he did, because if I read a couple verses later in John chapter 2, verses 20 and 21, John helps us out, and he says, but he spoke of the temple of his body. And so the question comes back, well, how about another rebuilt temple besides Jesus? Well, I think Jesus was a pretty good one, but 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, Paul says, do you not know that you are a temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. And so is he going to rebuild another temple beside Jesus? And I said, well, sort of, because we've been connected to Jesus, and you're that temple. Well, how about still another temple? And there my answer is, well, I don't know, we'll see. I'm not saying God can't, that nobody can construct something in Israel. We'll see. But the prophecy has been fulfilled again and again. And so I don't think we have to mandate, well, God, you have to do it, you have to build something with, I want to say flesh and blood, but that's what we are. You have to build something with concrete and mortar. Because he's already built the better temple and raised it up in 3 days. Okay. Will there be a future millennium? Yes, sir.
What will the dispensationalists say about the tribulation from Matthew 24?
They would look at Matthew, they would take most of that chapter and say that's all going to happen in a future period. And I'm going to use a chart in just a few minutes and look at that. But they would say that there will be first a rapture, and then, depending on who you talk to, because sometimes it changes a little bit, but generally a rapture, and then a 7-year period of tribulation, and then the second coming, and then the part that we're getting to right now, a 1,000-year literal reigning of Jesus on the earth as per Revelation chapter 20. And we're going to talk about that right now. What's interesting, when we talked about the fall of Jerusalem, the war against the Jews started 666 AD. It ended not with the fall of Jerusalem, but a couple of years later with the fall of Masada. 7 years. You want a 7-year tribulation? It was right there. And in the middle of it is when the temple was destroyed. So you sort of already got it. And most of the church, in fact, I would say all the church back then understood that. So it's relatively a recent thing to say, well, no, that has to happen again in the future, and especially this idea of two future comings of Jesus. Paula. How did the idea come about? There was a gentleman by the name of John Nelson Darby. He was a Christian. It's not a pagan sort of thing. John Nelson Darby lived in England in the 1830s. He came up with this idea. I'm not sure how he came up with it. There have been different reports, and I don't want to give too much credence to all of them. Some say that some woman in the church had I had a dream, but I don't think that's it. I think that he was studying the scriptures, and I think he came to what he thought was an honest conclusion. And there were a lot of these things happening in the 1800s. There was a fellow by the name of Miller who had looked at that prophecy in Daniel chapter 8 about how there will be 1,200 mornings and evenings or something like that. And he said, well, those are 1,200 years. And then he counted from Daniel's day to his day, and he said, Jesus is coming back in 1848 or 1852. It was sometime in the mid-1800s. And they had it down to the day. They were all waiting. And Jesus didn't come, very obviously. That group eventually said, well, he did come spiritually. He had his advent, and so they became known as Seventh-day Adventists, and they're still around today. That's how that group got started. There were other groups that said, well, he came spiritually a little bit later, our Jehovah's Witness friends. If you ever talk to a Jehovah's Witness and ask him, when did Jesus come back? They'll say it was 1914. They're wrong. And so a number of these things started around the same time. Now, I don't want to say that Darby was a pagan or even maybe I guess you could call that a cult, but I think that's being unkind. I think he meant well. I just think he was wrong. Okay? Will there be a future millennium? Now, here, the question itself is taken from Revelation chapter 20. Beginning of verse 1, when I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand, and he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. That's the millennial part. That's what the word millennium means, 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would no longer deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were completed. And after these, he must be released for a short time. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and those are all things that are related earlier in the book of Revelation, and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. So notice, in this millennial idea, you have the ruling and reigning of Jesus, you have where the nations are not deceived, and you have a resurrection. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. And the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. And then there's a blessing. Verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. That's the passage. The passage, it's the only one that speaks about 1,000 years. So that's the millennial passage. Now, I said before that before 1830, there were no Christians that held to a distinction between one coming of Jesus versus another coming. But here you have a picture of this millennial idea. And now the question is it literal or is it symbolic? And as opposed to that question that came up in the 1830s, this question was asked not in the 1830s, but way back in the early church. By at least the 2nd century, there were people that were saying it's literal. There were others that were saying it's symbolic. What were they saying in the 1st century? Good question. I'm not entirely sure. But by the 2nd century, this question, because it's sort of obvious, it's, either you take it very literally, or maybe you see it as symbolic. And in favor of that literal, that's just an easy way to read it. It says 1,000 years, so it's going to be 1,000 years. I get that. And so what we would call a premillennial, that means Jesus comes before the millennium, is just based upon this passage, on taking it quite literally. But that's the question. There's an awful lot in the book of Revelation that is symbolic. Like when John the writer hears about a lion of the tribe of Judah. We're not talking about lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Instead, it's a picture of Jesus. Or when he sees a lamb standing as though slain, and I still have a hard time imagining what that looks like because dead lambs, are lying down. They're dead. But this is a lamb standing as though slain. But it's okay if I can't figure out what that looks like. It's Jesus, right? I mean, we know that one. Or when there's a dragon or a beast, we're not talking about literal dragons or literal beasts. And so there's plenty that's symbolic, and now that's the question here. Is it literal? And guys, I have to tell you, maybe it is. I'm okay with that. But maybe it's symbolic. And so notice what happens here in Revelation chapter 20, and then compare it. Remember, when Jesus comes back, there's going to be a resurrection, and there's the judgment of the wicked, and Satan is judged, and we enter into this 1,000-year kingdom. That's the premillennial view. If you take it literally, these are the things that happens when Jesus comes back. But if we continue reading the rest of the chapter, and we're not going to read it now, I'll leave that as your homework. If we read the rest of Revelation 20 and see what happens at the end of that millennium, again there is a resurrection, again there's a judgment of the wicked, again there's a judgment of Satan, and again there's an entrance into the kingdom. Now maybe we're meant to understand that all those things are going to happen twice. Could be. If God does it that way, I'm all right with that. But maybe I have two different descriptions of the same thing. Maybe. And so this goes back to the question that TJ was asking, what does this all look like? The dispensational, or I could call it pre-tribulational and pre-millennial, because they sort of go together, it sees that, Jesus came and they were in this present age, and then the rapture takes place, followed by usually it'll be a 7-year tribulation, and then the second coming of Jesus takes place, followed by the millennium, and then another judgment and the eternal state. Now, at this point, I have to ask a question. It's a little test question. How long is the kingdom? Yeah, the kingdom's always an eternal kingdom, right? It's Old Testament, New Testament. It's always described as an eternal kingdom. Which means if you hold to not just dispensationalism, but we'll go to its counterpart. And now, dispensationalism, I believe, I threw in the word artificially because that's my own judgment. It separates between these two comings of Jesus. It says there's a rapture versus a second coming. I think that's entirely artificial. I think there's no distinction made in the scriptures. And there's no evidence for it between two separate comings. Yes?
What is that part where it says, two guys are walking up a hill and one's taking...
That's a great question. In Matthew chapter 24, around verse...
Jesus himself.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And it explains it a little bit earlier when it says he'll send forth his angels and gather together his elect. So it's them taking believers, right?
That's not a rapture?
Well, according to my dispensational friends, these guys say that's the second coming. Okay, they agree with me. That's the second coming. Dispensationalists believe that.
That's a physical,
Yeah. Yeah, right. But they'll tell you that's the second coming.
Unbelievers still wondering what's going on.
Yeah, I got a whole bunch of years ago, I was working with, this is back in my fire department days, and one of the other firefighters, and there were 3 of us going to be working the second half of the shift. There were more on duty, but we were going to be up and doing road patrols and stuff, and So one was a Christian with me, but one was not. At least he didn't identify. These days, he's actually identifying as a Christian, sort of an interesting story. But that night, he said, John, I've heard that you Christians believe that one day we're all going to be, and he uses Star Trek, beamed up, like in Star Trek. And I said, well, I wouldn't describe it that way, but I do believe Jesus is going to come and gather his people, and the Bible does teach that aspect. And he said, well, what happens if it takes place tonight? And this other Christian fellow, he says, well, then you're going to work the second half by yourself, you know. And we're still chuckling about that one. So I have the church age tribulation in dispensationalism. It's what's driving it is trying to segregate Israel and the church, and they can't, you know. So this is church, and this is Israel, but the church is in heaven because they're not on earth. And I'm not sure if they get rid of if they finally have a desegregation plan in the eternal state. Depends which dispensationalist you talk to.
Has every prophecy been fulfilled for the preparation of Jesus' return?
I believe it has. I believe if Jesus came back today, that we wouldn't be saying, wait a minute, God, you have to do this one, that one, the other one. Now, can God continue to do some things, like continue to win the world of Christ? Absolutely. But I don't think that anything remains to be done. Which means I believe Jesus could come back today. Wouldn't that be cool? Even so, come Lord Jesus. I would love that.
When Jesus gives the elect,
Hmm?
will be judging in the day.
I'm sorry.
When Jesus will give it, he gives the elect. The elect.
Oh, he'll gather his elect, right.
It will be judging in the day, the second time.
Well, yeah. John chapter 6, Jesus says about 4 times in this chapter. He says, he who believes in me, I'll raise him up on the last day. Now, wait a second. Is the last day this here? Which is the last day? Well, the last day is when he says he'll raise us up, which means that instead of having 3 different last days, and historic premillennialism says, well, no, this is the same thing. If you want to see a tribulation, that's fine, or if you want to see it all the way through, however you see that. But you have the second coming rapture. But then historic premillennialism says, yes, then you have 1,000 years, and it might be. I'm going to, again, that's something that at least certain elements of the church have held since at least the 2nd century, just based upon a literal reading of Revelation chapter 20. So that takes Revelation chapter 20 literally, but it also has to take the language of the last day when John chapter 6 verses 40 and 44 and 54 talk about the last day. It has to say, well, that's not literal because that happens here, but you've got more after that. You can't really have a last day because there's more days after that, which is okay. They're allowed to do that. Now the question is the kingdom now. Remember how Jesus said in Luke chapter 17, he said, don't be looking for the kingdom like over here or over there, or this sign, that sign. I tell you, the kingdom of heaven is in you. Now, Jesus said that. Now, and I'm not saying that there won't be a future manifestation of the kingdom, but there's a sense in which the kingdom's already here. And let me add that both dispensationalists and pretty much all Christians agree with what I just said. There's a sense in which the kingdom's already here. And we also saw John chapter 6, all those verses that talks about how he'll be raised upon the last day. Paul says, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 50, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. So that means if Jesus comes back and there's a physical kingdom, Paul said, flesh and blood cannot inherit that. And a premillennial view of that has flesh and blood people going into the kingdom, which might be a little bit problematic. So either you have to say, well, Paul, that's just generally speaking, maybe there's some exceptions, and okay. But there's also the passage that says he comes as a thief. And mind you, you've got Matthew 24, which is his return. You have Revelation chapter 3, verse 3, which talks to the church. He's coming like a thief, so be ready. And then there's also the passage in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10 that talks about the time when the heavens will be done away with and the earth and its works will be destroyed, which in the premillennial view is at the end of the millennium. So are those one or two or three different comings? Or is it all describing the same thing, in which he comes as a thief? I don't know. Maybe that's it. Maybe we are to understand that as symbolic. And so the amillennial view would see, well, yes, the church age, that's us today. And yes, the church has and is continuing to go through, not just the church, all sorts of people are going through tribulation. Just pick up your newspaper or a history book, take your pick. But Christians are being put to death today, and that's not a new thing. That's been going on since the beginning. And you say, wait a minute, is Jesus in any sense ruling today? Or are the nations, you see, this is taking Revelation chapter 20 as symbolic. It's taking the last day language in John chapter 6 literally. But here's the interesting thing. It talks about Satan being bound. Is Satan bound today? Wait a minute. Before you're so quick to answer that, I'm going to show you what Jesus had to say about it. And it's that he's bound specifically with his ability to deceive the nations. Think about what the nations looked like before Jesus came. Where could you go in the world, in the ancient world before Jesus, and hear the gospel preached and find Christians? You could find Jewish people that had been scattered around, and occasionally you might find what they called a God-fearer. But largely, in fact, Paul said this in Acts chapter 17 when he's addressing the folks in Athens. He says, having previously overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now saying, repent. Come and hear the gospel and believe. And so he recognizes that prior to that had been times of ignorance. Contrast that with today. You say, well, gee, people are still pretty ignorant. However, you can go everywhere in the world today and you can find Christians there. I'm not saying everybody's a Christian, but I'm saying that the church has spread. And it's not like we just got there last week. I'm talking about since the first century. The church has spread, and I think is continuing to spread throughout the world. And some of us are involved around the corner. Some of us, like my friend over here, Gordon, gets to go to Africa and on a pretty regular basis and meet with pastors and train up leaders. And it's still going on. It's still taking place. Where Satan, to some degree, has been bound with his ability to deceive the nations. Now, the wording there is interesting because Jesus says something very much like this in Matthew chapter 12, beginning of verse 27. This is where he'd been accused of performing miracles and casting out demons by being in league with Satan. And he says, and if I by Beelzebul, that's just another word for Satan, if I by Beelzebul cast out demons, by whom do your sons cast them out? Consequently, they will be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Or how can anyone enter the strong man's house? And notice who he's been talking about binding, who he's been talking about casting out demons. Or how can anyone enter the strong man's house and carry off his property unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house? Now what's been happening is Jesus comes on the scene and he's been casting out demons. And he's been releasing people. And he's been going to those people that sort of belong to Satan. I mean, they're demon-possessed. You can't get any more belong to Satan than that. And he's been stealing them from Satan. In a sense, he's been just tying up Satan so that he can rob him. And there's a sense in which we're still doing that today. Every time you share the gospel, every time somebody comes to Christ, Satan just got robbed. One more. And I think we're supposed to be in the Satan binding business. I mean, SBB, yeah, get a little bumper sticker or something. I think we're supposed to be in that business of sharing the gospel as a means of binding Satan and stealing his property. And Jesus said that. Now, does that mean that we should take Revelation chapter 20 in a symbolic way? Maybe. I think it's worth consideration. Of course, I saw this bumper sticker. I didn't take the picture. Somebody else did. In case of rapture, this car's driver will be rethinking his amillennial position. I thought that was sort of cute. But the point is that I think we're supposed to be serving Jesus, giving the gospel, looking for his coming. Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through about 15 says that. We're to be looking for, not the tribulation or the rebuilding of the temple, we're supposed to be looking for Jesus. And I think that should be our primary goal. So, next question. Is there a future Antichrist? And now that term Antichrist is used a couple of times, always by John, and never in the book of Revelation. It's used, for example, in 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. Children, it's the last hour, and just as you've heard that Antichrist is coming, they had heard that. Even now, many Antichrists have appeared. From this, we know that it's the last hour. So he's writing this close to 2,000 years ago. Is there a future Antichrist? And John back then was saying, well, there's already a bunch of them. Take your pick. Now, since that time, I think there probably have been some more. He goes on to say in 1 John 4, verse 3, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you've heard that it's coming, and now it is already in the world. So is there a future? Well, it depends if Jesus is coming back, like in the next 5 minutes. If not, then I guess there'll be a future in a few, because there's continuing. Well, how about a big Antichrist with a capital A? I think there's been some of those too. And maybe some more. We'll see. We'll see. I wanted to answer them all that were given. So you say, does this have to do with eschatology? Maybe somewhat. So I'm going to look at the question, is there a correlation between the flood and the end time? The next couple of questions are going to talk about that. The flood versus the end time. And again, I'm going to go to Matthew chapter 24, same chapter that we looked at earlier. But now it's talking about it's reference the second coming, and then it says, for as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. That's not the main point, but let me ask you for a second. The things that they were doing, were those bad things or good things? Or were they just things? Well, eating, drinking, we're doing some of that right here, guys. and I think it's okay. And marrying and giving. Now, maybe how they did it might have been wrong, but the thing, in other words, life went on. That's the point that he's making. They were just doing the same things that you guys are doing. You're eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. In other words, the point is that it's going to be unexpected, like a thief. You don't know when it's going to be. You won't be able to say, gee, the rapture took place 6 years and 48 days, or it's going to be unexpected. And if it's unexpected, that means maybe we haven't and he goes on to say, that you asked about this passage, this is just the next verse. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken, one will be left, 2 women will be grinded at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. Therefore, and here's the point, therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. That's the point. And that's the correlation I don't think they really realized exactly when the flood was coming. Maybe Noah did. But it came unexpectedly. And so therefore be on the alert because you don't know. Now, is this our final? Yeah, this is the final question. What about the giants back in the days of Noah? Since we asked the Noah question already. And the question itself comes from Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, where you have, and I'm using the New American Standard here, because the New American Standard, well, first of all, because I use it all the time, but the New American Standard, when it comes to that word giants, they said, how do we translate that? And they weren't quite sure, so they just left the Hebrew there. When in doubt, don't translate, just transliterate. Just leave the Hebrew and put English words there. And sometimes that works, sometimes it makes you wonder. But here, that word there, the King James and also the Septuagint rendered this giantess, which is just the Greek word for giant. And that's how the King James translated it this way. The New American Standard translators weren't sure, so they just put the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were mighty men who were men of old, men of renown, or men of the name, literally, in the men of Hashem. And so were these giants? And maybe, I'm not so sure. The word Nephilim, Nephal, a couple of people here have had Hebrew, and you guys know that there's a Nephal stem. You know how you have the cal stem, and that's like active, and Nephal just is the passive stem. It doesn't mean these guys were passive, just means you could call them the fallen ones. That's literally what it means. Now, were these fallen ones really big? Well, that idea comes from another passage. Hopefully, yes, I've got it here. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. It's the only other place where the word is used. And in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, this is where Joshua and Caleb and the other 10 spies, they go into the land, and they're giving their report. And there also we saw the Nephilim. Gee, here they are again. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, so we were in their sight. Now, I'm not sure that we're supposed to take this literally in the sense that they were 100 feet tall, but they might have been some big guys. You ever walk into a place where there's maybe all basketball players? And I'm not used to looking up at people. In fact, he's not here right now, but I'm thinking of one of our members, a guy by the name of Cade. You've seen him towering around. I'm not used to looking up at people, but hey, Cade, how you doing? Now, he's not 20 feet tall, but he's head and shoulders above me. And apparently these guys were a little bit bigger. Of course, I don't know how big Israelites were in that day, but the average Roman, in the days of the Romans, the average Roman centurion was about 5'4". I'm not saying everybody was short back then, but some people were. And some people were a good 6 feet and whatever. So not everybody was of the same height. And there were some folk, you know how we would say he's a, trying to think of a word that just describes some big old hulk of a guy. I'll use that term. He was a hulk. We've even got a comic book character named that, right? But aside from Marvel comic books, if I describe somebody as a Hulk, he's a big guy. And you say, wait a second, I thought the Hulks were way back when. Well, there were some of them back then too. In other words, it's a term that might just describe some big guy. And there were big guys, probably are still, depending on where you go, there probably are some around. Not necessarily that they're from like a different kind of human being, they're just big guys. So what about them back in the days of Noah? There were some back then, and there were some in Joshua's day, not necessarily related, because everybody died in the flood except Noah and his family, but just some other big guys. Just a Hebrew way of describing those. And that comes to the questions that I've got, and I've still got, I don't have any more time.